Ethan Carter had always prided himself on his independent spirit and unwavering commitment to doing things the right way. A decorated military veteran, now serving as a city official, Ethan's life was defined by honor, discipline, and a deep-seated love for freedom, a love that resonated in every corner of his modest suburban haven. His ivy-clad home, a quiet retreat away from the bustle of city life, was more than just a dwelling. It was a sanctuary built on memories of sacrifice and hard-won victories, a place where each brick and tree whispered stories of resilience. But among all the cherished features of his property, none held as much sentimental and literal value as his private pool. For Ethan, the pool was more than a leisure amenity. It was a crystalline oasis, symbolizing the rewards of perseverance, a refreshing escape from the daily grind, and an emblem of personal liberty. Every summer morning, before the world had fully awoken, he would slip into the cool water. The gentle lapping of the water, the soft caress of sunlight on rippling surfaces, and the solitary silence that enveloped him became a ritual, a moment of quiet defiance against a world that often sought to regulate every detail of one's life. Yet not everyone in the neighborhood shared Ethan's reverence for independent living. Overseeing the community with an uncompromising and self-appointed sense of duty was Karen Thompson, the notorious HOA Karen. With her impeccably styled hair and a haughty air that bordered on imperious, Karen had fashioned herself as the arbiter of suburban perfection. From the moment Ethan moved into the neighborhood, she had set her sights on enforcing the HOA's rigid and, at times, absurd regulations. Her mission was clear: ensure that every resident bowed to an unwavering standard of conformity, no matter how trivial the infraction. It wasn't long before the cracks in the idyllic facade began to show. At weekly HOA meetings, Karen's steely gaze and clipped remarks left little doubt that she was determined to micromanage every facet of community life. While many residents silently accepted the HOA's overreaching rules, Ethan's independent streak and unwillingness to submit to needless bureaucracy made him a prime target. His property, his carefully nurtured retreat with its centerpiece, the sparkling pool, soon became a battleground for ideals: the right to personal freedom versus an obsessive enforcement of arbitrary standards. The tension finally came to a head on a bright, seemingly ordinary morning. Ethan had just emerged from an early swim, the water still glistening on his skin, when he heard a knock on his front door. Opening it, he found Karen standing there, an envelope of violation notices clutched in her hand and a self-satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Ethan," she began in a tone that brooked no argument, "I'm here to discuss a very serious matter regarding your property." Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept over the serene backyard. According to the latest revisions to our HOA guidelines, any water feature, even a private pool, is deemed a communal asset unless it's properly registered with the board. And, as of this morning, your pool is in violation. Ethan's mind raced. "Communal asset?" he repeated, incredulous. "This is my private pool, Karen. I pay for its upkeep, and it's been part of my home since day one. It isn't some community amenity you can just claim." But Karen was unmoved by his protest. "Rules are rules," she declared, tapping the stack of papers against her palm with deliberate emphasis. "You have until the end of the week to either register your pool or face a series of fines and further legal action. I expect full compliance, Ethan." Her tone brooked no dissent. In that moment, the warm promise of a quiet day by the pool transformed into the prelude of a looming storm. A storm of bureaucratic overreach and personal vendettas. As Ethan stood in his doorway, still half draped in the remnants of his swim, he felt an unexpected surge of defiance. The pool was not merely water enclosed by tiled edges. It was a symbol of his autonomy, his right to enjoy his hard-won privacy without an overzealous gatekeeper dictating every move. "I'm within my rights, Karen," Ethan replied steadily, though the firmness in his voice betrayed a spark of rebellion. "I've met every requirement a homeowner is supposed to. This pool is part of my property, and your so-called regulations don't change that fact." Their exchange, initially civil in appearance, quickly escalated. Karen's eyes narrowed as she repeated her ultimatum, her voice a blend of smug superiority and cold resolve. For Ethan, the encounter was a stark introduction to a battle that would soon engulf not only his peaceful retreat, but the very spirit of the community itself. As Karen departed with a final, imperious nod, Ethan was left staring after her, a man caught between the solace of his private haven and the encroaching tide of HOA tyranny. He knew deep down that this confrontation was only the first salvo in what would become a long, grueling fight for the right to control his own domain. In that moment, the shimmering surface of his pool reflected not just the light of day, but the dawning realization of a war for personal freedom. The morning after that fateful confrontation, Ethan awoke to an unsettling silence that belied the impending storm. As the sun crept over the horizon, its rays revealed an unexpected sight, a thick envelope taped to his front door. Hesitant yet resolute, Ethan retrieved the package and carefully opened it. Inside were several documents, official fines, stern warning letters, and a legal notice, all meticulously typed and sealed with the HOA's emblem. Each paper dripped with the authority of a board determined to quash any hint of defiance. Violation notice, unauthorized modification of private property, read one of the documents in bold red letters. Ethan's eyes scanned the page, noting an outrageous fine of $750 levied for improper use of communal water facilities. It was ludicrous. His private pool, the very emblem of his personal freedom, had suddenly been rebranded as a community amenity under the guise of new HOA policies. At that moment, the sound of measured footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Peering through his window, Ethan saw Karen standing on the sidewalk, arms folded and a self-satisfied smirk firmly in place. Her posture was one of absolute certainty, as if the law itself had been rewritten overnight in her favor. "Good morning, Ethan," Karen called out with a crisp tone that brooked no discussion. "I trust you received the official notice. You must understand that our HOA rules are clear. There's no room for personal interpretation." Her words were delivered with the air of someone accustomed to wielding unchecked power. Ethan stepped outside, the envelope still clutched in his hand. "Karen, these fines are preposterous," he replied, his voice steady but laced with incredulity. "I've followed every regulation set forth by the city. My pool is my property, and there's no legal basis for this reclassification." Karen's eyes narrowed. "The rules apply to everyone equally, Ethan. Ignorance of the law is no excuse for noncompliance. I'm merely enforcing what has been mandated by the HOA board." She gestured dismissively at the envelope. "Now, I expect to see your compliance by the end of the week." Ethan felt a surge of defiance rising within him. "I'm aware of my rights," he said firmly. "These so-called mandates are nothing more than arbitrary rules without legal grounding. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the city's zoning department. They'll see that you're overstepping your bounds." Not one to accept a challenge, Karen's smirk deepened. "Do that if you must," she replied coolly. "But remember, the HOA doesn't take kindly to those who defy its authority." Her tone was a mix of warning and triumph, as if daring him to test the limits of her power. Within hours, the quiet suburb was buzzing with activity. As Ethan began his day, a series of phone calls and frantic messages disrupted the calm of his routine. The HOA had mobilized, inspectors were dispatched to his property, and a team of officials began circling the neighborhood in search of any infraction that could justify further penalties. It became clear that Karen was not merely content with fines. She was intent on using every bureaucratic tool at her disposal to enforce a climate of fear and conformity. Ethan watched from his front window as two inspectors approached, clipboards in hand, ready to scrutinize every inch of his home. He greeted them politely and explained that he had already initiated contact with the local zoning office. One inspector, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, promised to review the documentation and verify whether the HOA's claims held any water, both figuratively and literally. Yet even as he spoke, Ethan sensed that the process was being manipulated behind the scenes. Later that afternoon, as he sat in his study poring over local ordinances and property laws, Ethan received a phone call from a concerned neighbor. The voice on the other end was hushed, almost conspiratorial. "Ethan, I heard that Karen called the police this morning," the neighbor confided. "Apparently, she claimed that your pool is a public nuisance, a hazard to the community." I couldn't believe it. This revelation only solidified Ethan's resolve. "She's turning everything into a power play," he muttered. "First, she sends me outrageous fines. Now she's dragging law enforcement into this farce." Determined not to be bullied, he documented every interaction. Photos of the envelope, screenshots of threatening text messages, and notes from the inspector's visits were carefully compiled into a digital dossier, a safeguard against the looming overreach. That evening, as Karen made another unscheduled visit to his property, the tension reached a fever pitch. Standing on the edge of his meticulously maintained lawn, she reiterated her demands. "Ethan, this isn't just about your pool. It's about maintaining the integrity of our community. The HOA will not tolerate exceptions." Ethan met her gaze steadily. "Maintaining integrity doesn't mean trampling on individual rights," he countered. "I'm prepared to take this to the city and, if necessary, to court." Karen's eyes flashed with a mixture of indignation and determination. "Then prepare for the consequences," she warned, before turning on her heel and disappearing into the dusk. As night fell, the suburb was cloaked in an uneasy calm. Ethan sat at his desk, the glow of his computer screen illuminating the mounting evidence of HOA malfeasance. The documents in the envelope were not just pieces of paper. They were the opening salvo in a battle for property rights and personal liberty. And while Karen believed that her tactics of fines, threats, and bureaucratic intimidation would force compliance, Ethan knew that the fight had only just begun. The seeds of resistance had been planted, and with each passing moment, he grew more determined to expose the injustice lurking behind the polished veneer of the HOA. Morning light filtered through Ethan's window as he sat at his kitchen table, coffee in hand, reviewing yet another round of notices posted on his door. Unlike the previous day's warnings, today's documents bore even harsher accusations. The papers detailed violations for unauthorized structural modifications and cited non-existent community standards, claims that threatened immediate eviction, and even the seizure of property if remedial actions weren't taken within 48 hours. It wasn't merely a bureaucratic error. It was a calculated power play. Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized the breadth of Karen's ambition. Over the past weeks, rumors had begun circulating among his neighbors. Linda, a longtime resident with a sharp eye for detail, confided in hushed tones, "I got a notice last week saying my garden fence is too tall, even though the guidelines never mention height limits. Something is very off." Her words were echoed by several others who had received similarly preposterous citations. The consistency of these baseless claims pointed to a deliberate strategy. Karen was fabricating violations to intimidate and control. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan began combing through the HOA's meeting minutes and financial records late into the night. What he discovered was alarming. Several entries in the minutes referenced ad hoc amendments to the rules, amendments that were never formally discussed or voted on by the board. It appeared that Karen had been issuing fines based on her personal interpretation of vague clauses, and in some instances, even fabricating them altogether. The more Ethan read, the clearer it became that the HOA was being manipulated for personal gain. Realizing he couldn't take on this battle alone, Ethan reached out to a couple of board members who had quietly expressed their doubts about Karen's leadership. In a discreet meeting at a local coffee shop, Mark, one of the more seasoned board members, leaned forward and said, "I've been noticing irregularities too. Fines are being levied that simply don't add up, and some of the funds disappear without a trace. I believe Karen is using her authority to benefit herself, and we all might be complicit if we don't act." Simone, another board member, nodded in agreement. "I've seen discrepancies in our financial reports that I can't explain. This isn't about enforcing rules, it's about control and profit." Emboldened by their confessions, Ethan proposed a plan. "We need to document every encounter," he urged. "I'm setting up cameras around my property to record any interaction with the HOA inspectors. If we can capture evidence of misconduct, We'll have no choice but to take this to the city and the media." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd spent years upholding the law, now prepared to use it as his shield against tyranny. In the days that followed, Ethan's property became both a battleground and a surveillance post. Hidden cameras discreetly recorded every visit from inspectors, whose rehearsed scripts and stern expressions grew increasingly unsettling. In one instance, an inspector approached with an air of scripted authority, quoting obscure regulations that Ethan later discovered were not part of any official document. His eyes, though blank in his formal greeting, betrayed a rehearsed complicity that left Ethan reeling. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to buzz with discontent. At a community potluck held in a local park, residents shared their experiences of receiving absurd violation notices. Mr. Johnston, a retired engineer known for his candid opinions, declared, "We move here for a peaceful life, not to be bullied by an overzealous board member playing judge, jury, and executioner." His words resonated with the crowd, igniting murmurs of support for Ethan's stance. Fueled by this growing alliance, Ethan meticulously organized all the evidence. Photographs of the falsified notices, video clips capturing the scripted encounters, and copies of the manipulated HOA minutes were compiled into a comprehensive dossier. Each piece of evidence was a counterstrike against the arbitrary tyranny that Karen was unleashing on the community. Determined to ensure that these injustices did not go unnoticed, Ethan also contacted a local attorney specializing in property rights and HOA disputes. The attorney, Ms. Delgado, reviewed the dossier and confirmed Ethan's worst fears. "These notices lack any legal standing," she stated firmly. "Karen's actions not only violate local ordinances, but also abuse the trust placed in the HOA. We have a strong case to challenge her authority and possibly dismantle this corrupt system." Her assurance galvanized Ethan even further. He knew that this was a fight not just for his private pool, but for the fundamental right of every homeowner to live free from arbitrary control. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat in his study surrounded by the tangible evidence of the HOA's misconduct. The quiet hum of his computer filled the room as he prepared to upload the dossier to a secure community forum, a digital town hall where residents could share their grievances and strategize a collective response. The weight of the injustice was palpable, yet within it burned a fierce resolve. Karen's tactics had now escalated beyond simple fines and warnings. The HOA, under her iron-fisted rule, was morphing into a tool of personal vendetta, a weapon used to instill fear and enforce blind obedience. But with every piece of evidence, every whispered confession, and every shared story, the community's resolve grew stronger. Ethan knew that the battle was far from over. It had only just begun. And as the first real cracks appeared in the facade of Karen's regime, a beacon of hope emerged from the collective courage of those who refused to be cowed. Dawn broke with an unsettling air of urgency over Ethan's neighborhood. He awoke not to the gentle hum of summer, but to the clamor of machinery and the unmistakable rumble of an engine. Rushing outside, Ethan was met with a shocking scene. A tow truck was methodically dragging his car from the driveway. The vehicle, his trusted companion through many a long day, was now caught in the grip of the HOA's iron-fisted enforcement. A hastily pinned notice on the truck's door declared that his car was illicitly parked on HOA-designated property, despite Ethan's driveway being clearly marked as his private space. Heart pounding, Ethan immediately dialed the local non-emergency number. When an officer arrived, Ethan calmly explained the situation, citing zoning laws and property deeds that confirmed his rightful ownership. But even as the officer reviewed the documents, a shadow fell over Ethan's relief. Karen had arrived on the scene, her expression one of cold triumph. "Ethan, you know better than to disregard the community guidelines," Karen said, her voice clipped as she observed his frustration. "This isn't just about a car. It's about ensuring every homeowner adheres to our community standards." She made no effort to hide the smug satisfaction in her tone, as if her power was absolute. While the officer temporarily delayed the tow truck, Ethan's mind raced. This was no isolated misstep. It was a deliberate escalation. Determined to turn the tables, he swiftly gathered the remnants of his evidence: copies of property deeds, zoning ordinances, and a log of previous infractions that had been levied without proper cause. He needed to expose the underlying corruption that had given Karen the power to reinterpret rules at her whim. Later that day, Ethan stormed into a specially convened community meeting held in the local community center. The atmosphere was tense. Neighbors murmured anxiously about their own run-ins with the HOA's erratic behavior. Standing at the front, Ethan laid out his evidence with a calm authority. He detailed how Karen had overstepped her bounds, not only by towing his car unjustly, but by issuing fines and directives that blatantly contradicted established legal standards. "It's not just my car that's been targeted," Ethan declared, his voice resonating in the silent room. "Every one of you has been subjected to arbitrary fines and unauthorized interventions. This isn't about maintaining a certain aesthetic, it's about power. Karen and the board are using these rules to control us, to intimidate us into submission." His words rippled through the audience, a mix of anger and disbelief transforming into a shared resolve. As murmurs of agreement grew louder, several community members stepped forward with their own stories: tales of sudden utility shutoffs, inexplicable fines, and even threats of legal action over minor infractions. With each account, the narrative of an oppressive, overreaching HOA solidified. The community was not going to let fear dictate their lives any longer. Determined to strike back with the full force of the law, Ethan had already enlisted the help of a seasoned attorney who specialized in property rights. Together, they prepared a detailed legal brief, outlining the numerous violations of local and state laws committed by the HOA. Copies of this brief were distributed among the homeowners and later shared online through neighborhood social media groups and local news outlets. The public exposure of these irregularities turned the tide of opinion sharply in favor of the residents. Karen, realizing that her grip on the community was slipping, became increasingly frantic. At the next HOA meeting, now sparsely attended by board members who appeared visibly discomfited, she tried to rally her remaining loyalists. However, when Ethan boldly stepped forward, file in hand, and presented incontrovertible evidence of misappropriated funds, fabricated violations, and personal bias, the room fell into a heavy silence. Even those who had once nodded in quiet agreement were now forced to confront the corruption at the heart of their community's governance. In a final desperate move, Karen threatened to pursue a lawsuit against Ethan for defamation and slander. But the very documents she wielded against him were now on public display, each piece a testament to a system rigged for her personal gain. The local media, sensing a story of David versus Goliath, began covering the saga, and soon the community's fight against the HOA's tyranny was the talk of the town. By evening's close, the balance of power had irreversibly shifted. Ethan's quiet, determined defiance had not only stymied Karen's extreme measures, but had ignited a collective uprising among homeowners tired of being governed by an autocrat in disguise. As he looked out at the faces of his once docile neighbors, Ethan felt a profound sense of vindication. His personal battle had become a beacon of resistance, a call for accountability and respect for individual rights. In that moment, as the last vestiges of the day's turmoil faded into a hard-won calm, Ethan knew that the war for personal freedom was far from over. But the first major victory against the HOA's overreach had been claimed. The community, now awakened and united, was ready to reclaim not just their homes, but the very notion of what it meant to live free from arbitrary tyranny. Late one humid afternoon, the tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Karen, desperate to salvage her crumbling authority, hatched what she believed would be her ultimate power play. In a bid to intimidate Ethan once and for all, she made a dramatic phone call to the local police. With calculated precision, she dialed the non-emergency number and reported what she termed a public disturbance emanating from Ethan's property. According to her, the bright, welcoming glow of his porch lights was not only a breach of HOA aesthetics, but also a safety hazard that disrupted the peace of the community. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of Ethan's house. As officers stepped out, Karen stood at the edge of the lawn, her posture rigid with self-assured authority. Before the officers could knock on the door, Karen launched into a rehearsed spiel about how Ethan's unregulated modifications were causing chaos. "Your client is violating community safety codes," she asserted with a tone that brooked no dissent. Ethan, who had been preparing his evening paperwork in his study, quickly responded by stepping onto his porch. With calm determination, he flashed his city official badge, a move that left the officers visibly perplexed. "I assure you," Ethan said, his voice even but laced with quiet resolve, "my property complies with every regulation. My porch lights are simply a part of my home's design." The officers, recognizing his credentials, exchanged glances that spoke of both irritation and disbelief. They informed Karen that her call was unfounded and, with a curt nod, left the scene, leaving her momentarily deflated. Yet Karen wasn't finished. In a frantic bid to maintain her grip on power, she decided to escalate her campaign of harassment by hiring a private investigator. Her objective was clear: dig up any scandal or misstep on Ethan's part that she could use to discredit him and justify her draconian measures. Over the following days, whispers began to circulate about a shadowy figure seen lurking near Ethan's property late at night. Ethan, ever vigilant, had already anticipated that Karen might not stop at empty threats. He had installed additional security cameras around his home, not just to monitor for unauthorized visits, but to capture any act of intrusion. One cool moonlit night, as Ethan reviewed the footage from his newly installed cameras, he noticed something alarming. A dark figure, cloaked in the anonymity of the night, was seen creeping along the perimeter of his property. The camera's infrared view revealed not a resident in need, but a man meticulously maneuvering toward Ethan's garage. Curiosity and concern mounting, Ethan rewound the footage. The intruder, clearly identified by the unique gait and a distinct set of features, was none other than the private investigator hired by Karen. The man was caught on tape trying to tamper with Ethan's car, a move that constituted trespassing and potential theft of personal information. Determined to seize this opportunity, Ethan marked the exact time and position of the breach and made several copies of the footage, knowing that this evidence could be the key to exposing Karen's abuse of power. The following week, the community meeting that Ethan had organized took on an electrifying urgency. Homeowners, who had grown weary of Karen's relentless and unjustified tactics, packed the local community center. As the meeting progressed, murmurs of discontent rose steadily until Ethan, with his evidence in hand, took center stage. "Today, I'm not just fighting for my property," he began, his voice resonating with passion. "I'm fighting for every single one of us who has been bullied by arbitrary rules and unchecked authority." With deliberate calm, he played the security footage on the large screen at the front of the room. The room fell silent as the grainy image of the private investigator's unauthorized visit unfolded. The unmistakable moment when the intruder attempted to open Ethan's garage door sent a ripple of shock through the audience. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps echoed around the room as homeowners exchanged incredulous looks. "This is the evidence we've been waiting for," Ethan declared. Karen's desperation knows no bounds. She stooped to hiring men to spy on her neighbors and break the law just to maintain her control. The room erupted in a mixture of anger and vindication, with many residents voicing their own frustrations over past encounters with Karen's overreach. Karen, who had been watching the proceedings from a secluded corner, paled visibly as her final act of intimidation was laid bare for all to see. With her clandestine move exposed, the power dynamic shifted irreversibly. A community once cowed by her smug proclamations now stood united, their collective outrage transforming into a formidable force for change. In the days that followed, local authorities began investigating Karen's actions. The police, now aware of the evidence against her, started to scrutinize the legitimacy of her prior complaints and the financial irregularities within the HOA. Karen's attempts to salvage her reputation by threatening further lawsuits only deepened the public's skepticism. By the time the next HOA meeting convened, it was clear that Karen's days of dictating terms were numbered. The board, along with the empowered community, demanded accountability, not just for her baseless fines and calls to the police, but for her blatant misuse of power. Karen's final, desperate move had backfired spectacularly, leaving her exposed and isolated. As the meeting drew to a close, Ethan's words resonated in the hushed atmosphere. This isn't just about a pool or a car or a set of rules. It's about our right to live our lives free from fear and coercion. Today, we've taken back control. Today, we stand as a community united in truth and justice. The weight of Karen's exposed treachery settled over the room, a poignant reminder that no one, no matter how self-appointed or entitled, was above the law. The mic drop moment had come, and it was clear to everyone present that Karen's reign of terror was at an end. The tide had turned. In the wake of mounting evidence and public outcry, the once feared HOA now found itself drowning in scandal. What began as isolated acts of intimidation and bureaucratic overreach had evolved into a full-blown revolt against corruption, with Ethan at the forefront of the movement. At the next emergency board meeting, the atmosphere was charged with tension and disbelief. Several board members, previously cowed into silence by Karen's domineering presence, finally mustered the courage to speak up. "We can no longer ignore the evidence," declared board member Mark, his voice steady and resolute. "Karen's actions have not only breached our trust, but have also endangered the spirit of our community." His words echoed in the hushed room, galvanizing others to confess their own reservations about Karen's leadership. As the meeting progressed, a formal vote was put forward. Karen Thompson, the self-styled enforcer of arbitrary rules, was to be removed from her position as the HOA president. The vote was unanimous. In that decisive moment, Karen's facade of invincibility crumbled. The board's decision was swiftly communicated to the homeowners at a community assembly, where the mood was electric with vindication. For many residents, the vote symbolized more than just a change in leadership. It was a restoration of their fundamental rights as homeowners. The once silent community erupted in cheers and applause, celebrating not only the removal of a tyrant, but also the return of transparency and fairness. Neighbors who had suffered quietly under Karen's reign now found a voice, united in their desire to reclaim their neighborhood. In the days that followed, local authorities began a thorough investigation into the HOA's practices. The inquiry revealed a tangled web of financial mismanagement, forged documents, and unauthorized use of community funds. As the investigation unfolded, the HOA was slapped with a hefty fine for its illegal practices. News of the scandal quickly spread through local media, painting a damning picture of systemic abuse, a picture in which Karen was the central figure. Facing mounting legal pressure and public humiliation, Karen's personal and professional life unraveled at a breathtaking pace. The community's relentless pursuit of justice led to a series of civil suits against the HOA. One by one, Karen's closest allies on the board either resigned or were compelled to cooperate with the investigation. Isolated and shamed, Karen was forced to tender her resignation in a public letter that not only acknowledged her missteps, but also warned of further legal action should the misconduct continue. The final blow came when the city, determined to restore order and protect residents' rights, mandated a complete overhaul of the HOA's governing structure. The entire board was dissolved and a new democratically elected committee was put in place to ensure fairness and accountability. As for Karen, her once imposing presence was reduced to that of a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when power is abused without checks and balances. The impact on Karen's personal assets was swift and severe. Overnight, real estate agents began listing her house, a luxurious property that had once been her power base, citing urgent liquidation as the reason. The news rippled through the community, a stark reminder that those who rule by fear will ultimately find themselves cast out by the very people they sought to control. Amidst the chaos, Ethan found a quiet moment of triumph. Sitting on his sunlit porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, he surveyed the neighborhood that had fought so hard to reclaim its dignity. The familiar sparkle of his private pool mirrored the newfound hope and freedom of the community. In that serene moment, the long, arduous battle against HOA tyranny felt like it had finally reached a close. Yet Ethan knew that victory was not simply a matter of removing a single individual. It was about setting a precedent. The community had learned that power, when exercised without accountability, would eventually be overthrown by the united will of those it sought to subjugate. As residents exchanged relieved smiles and discussed plans for a more inclusive and transparent future, Ethan couldn't help but feel that his struggle was part of something far larger than his own private property rights. It was a stand for every homeowner's right to live without undue interference, and for every voice to be heard. In the aftermath, community gatherings transformed into vibrant forums of discussion, where ideas for neighborhood improvement were freely exchanged. The new HOA committee, elected by the very residents who had suffered under Karen's rule, pledged to operate with honesty, integrity, and a genuine commitment to the public good. And while Karen's name faded into the annals of local infamy, Ethan's steady resolve and dedication to justice became a beacon of hope, a reminder that when the people unite, even the most overbearing regime can be dismantled. In the wake of the public uproar and relentless evidence gathering, the authorities moved decisively to dismantle the corrupt framework of the HOA. A team of county investigators arrived, combing through financial records, meeting minutes, and internal correspondence. What they discovered was a systematic abuse of power, funds misappropriated for personal projects, unauthorized rule changes, and fines levied on flimsy pretenses. The investigation's findings painted a damning picture of an organization that had strayed far beyond its legal authority. Within days, the county legal department issued a sweeping injunction against the HOA. Fines totaling tens of thousands of dollars were levied for illegally enforcing non-existent regulations and misusing community funds. The injunction effectively froze the HOA's operations, sending shockwaves throughout the neighborhood. For many residents, this was the validation of their long-held suspicions, a promise that the days of arbitrary rule were finally numbered. Ethan, who had meticulously documented every instance of abuse, now found himself at the forefront of a legal battle. At a community forum held in the local town hall, he addressed a room filled with weary yet hopeful homeowners. "We are not just fighting for individual grievances," he declared, his voice resonating with determination. "This class action lawsuit is our collective stand against a system that trampled on our rights." With his detailed dossier as the cornerstone of their case, neighbors joined forces under the leadership of a seasoned attorney renowned for championing the underdog against institutional overreach. As the lawsuit gained momentum, local media picked up the story. Court hearings became public spectacles, with every session scrutinized by reporters eager to expose the full extent of the HOA's misconduct. In one particularly riveting televised hearing, Ethan's attorney presented clear evidence: misplaced funds, manipulated meeting minutes, and recorded conversations that left little doubt about the board's intent to exploit its power for personal gain. Simultaneously, individual board members who had quietly abetted the corruption began facing their own legal challenges. Several were indicted on charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy, their actions now laid bare before a court of law. Meanwhile, the state's Bar Association initiated an inquiry into Karen's longtime legal advisor. Evidence soon emerged that the lawyer had not only given questionable counsel in exchange for undisclosed payments, but had also actively participated in drafting some of the dubious regulations. In a climactic courtroom scene, the judge delivered a verdict that would mark a turning point for the entire community. Based on the overwhelming evidence and the flagrant violation of statutory authority, this court orders the dissolution of the HOA, she pronounced, her words echoing through the packed chamber. The ruling mandated that all assets be seized and redistributed to compensate the aggrieved homeowners, a final, resounding blow to a system that had long oppressed them. Not one to rest on his laurels, Ethan executed his final power move by releasing the full investigation report to the public. Distributed through local news outlets and shared widely on social media, the report detailed every misstep, every instance of overreach, and every piece of evidence collected over the months-long battle. At a follow-up community gathering, Ethan addressed his neighbors once more. "Today, we have shown that no one is above the law," he declared. "This isn't just our victory. It's a new beginning for every homeowner who has ever felt voiceless. With the dissolution of the HOA, the oppressive era came to an end. The community's resilience and unity had not only reclaimed their rights, but had also set a precedent, a powerful reminder that when people stand together, even the most entrenched tyranny can be dismantled. In the aftermath of the HOA's legal and public collapse, Karen Thompson's once imposing presence was reduced to a series of bitter ironies. The community that had once feared her overbearing dictates now watched with a mix of relief and schadenfreude as her carefully constructed empire unraveled. It all began with financial ruin. Karen's lavish townhouse, a symbol of her self-importance and authority, was swiftly put on the market after foreclosure notices started appearing. The very real threat of losing her prized property, once the centerpiece of her power, was a blow she had never anticipated. Neighbors whispered about the irony. The woman who had ruled by issuing fines and enforcing absurd regulations was now at the mercy of a system that treated her no differently than any other homeowner. As if that weren't enough, Karen's expensive car, a sleek, gleaming vehicle that she once used to parade her status, was repossessed after a series of defaulted loans tied to her extravagant lifestyle. The repossession became a local headline, and soon every passerby on the street knew that the mighty HOA enforcer had fallen from grace. The community, long tired of her relentless control, found a strange comfort in witnessing her public humiliation. Public appearances, once arenas for Karen's authoritarian showmanship, turned into spectacles of her desperation. At City Hall, where she had once intimidated officials with her curt, unyielding tone, Karen now found herself the subject of derision. During one particularly fraught encounter, as she attempted to argue over a minor infraction, a small crowd gathered outside erupted in laughter and pointed fingers. Even the officials, who had once bowed to her unspoken threats, exchanged knowing glances that said, "The joke's on you now." A final, symbolic encounter sealed her downfall. One brisk morning at a local coffee shop, Karen unexpectedly crossed paths with Ethan Carter, now hailed as the neighborhood's champion of justice. Clutching a worn briefcase and struggling to maintain her composure, she forced a tentative smile. Ethan, ever calm and collected, offered a polite nod and remarked quietly, "I hope you enjoy your new role." It must be strange to follow rules after spending so long imposing them. His words, gentle yet laced with irony, resonated deeply. For many, it encapsulated the poetic justice of a woman who had long believed herself above accountability. In the weeks that followed, the rumors grew louder. Unconfirmed reports even suggested that Karen had accepted a low-level position, an assistant property manager, for another HOA in a neighboring town. The thought of her having to work under the very system she had once manipulated was too delicious not to mention. Her days, once filled with the authority to dictate every detail of the community, were now consumed by mundane tasks and constant reminders of her prior misdeeds. Karen Thompson's personal downfall wasn't just a story of lost power. It became a living, cautionary tale. She had been the face of arbitrary enforcement and unchecked entitlement, and now her fate served as a stark reminder to everyone. When power is abused, it invariably turns against its wielder. As the community continued to heal and rebuild, the legacy of Karen's tyranny faded into whispered legends, a testament to the fact that no one, regardless of how high they might climb, is ever truly above the law. In the months that followed the dramatic collapse of the HOA and Karen's public downfall, the neighborhood blossomed into a vibrant tapestry of unity and renewed spirit. The dark days of arbitrary fines and oppressive regulations were slowly becoming distant memories, replaced by laughter, camaraderie, and a shared sense of liberation. Neighbors who had once whispered about injustice now gathered openly at community events, celebrating their regained autonomy and the dawn of a fairer system. Ethan Carter, now a symbol of resilience and justice, spent his mornings on his sun-dappled porch, a place where the gentle ripple of his private pool reflected both the clear blue sky and the collective triumph of his community. His home had always been more than just a shelter. It was a sanctuary of freedom, and it had become a beacon of hope for all those who had long yearned for a life unburdened by needless control. At the now infamous former community center, a new chapter was being written. The space was transformed into a forum where residents not only discussed local improvements, but also shared ideas on how to safeguard their rights in the future. Workshops, neighborhood barbecues, and open town halls became regular fixtures, a far cry from the secretive meetings held in fear under Karen's rule. The atmosphere buzzed with a kind of honest dialogue that only emerges when people are united by a common purpose. One brisk autumn afternoon, as golden leaves danced across the quiet streets, a light-hearted moment captured the essence of the community's rebirth. At a small gathering in the park, a mischievous resident, known for his playful spirit, jokingly produced an oversized, handmade HOA violation notice, this time citing the absurd infraction of excessive neighborliness. The sign was met with roaring laughter as residents playfully accused each other of violating the new, informal rule of always lending a helping hand. Ethan, grinning as he sipped his coffee, mused, "They really tried, but in the end, no one can outrule the spirit of community." The final mic drop moment, however, came unexpectedly. A local reporter, inspired by the community's transformation, produced a heartfelt documentary that interwove personal stories of hardship with triumphant accounts of resistance. In its closing scenes, the film showed Ethan surrounded by smiling neighbors as he gently tapped the side of his pool, a symbolic gesture that rippled across the screen like a timeless reminder. "This pool," he said, "is not just water in a backyard. It's a symbol that our lives are ours to shape, free from undue interference." With that final image, the documentary concluded, leaving viewers with a lingering sense of justice served and an enduring message. When a community unites, even the mightiest oppressors can be brought down. And so, as twilight settled over the neighborhood, the era of arbitrary control faded into legend, replaced by a future where every homeowner's voice was cherished and celebrated.